I'm Alondra Nelson. I'm the Harold F. Linder Professor here at the Institute for Advanced Study and the School of Social Science, where I also lead the Science, Technology, and Social Values Lab. So I'm pleased to welcome you to a discussion about the hidden architecture of artificial intelligence, one that stretches from environmental degradation and copper mining in Chile to the lithium extraction sites of Central Africa and well beyond. We are here to discuss the intersections of artificial intelligence, critical minerals, and the geopolitics that connects data centers in Northern Virginia to cobalt mines in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Connections that many of us, until recently, never thought to make, and that scholars must do much more to understand. AI, critical minerals, geopolitics. These are the themes of a workshop getting underway here at IAS tomorrow that brings together researchers from academia, civil society, and policy, experts who've spent years studying the social and political implications of mining alongside those who dissect the intricacies of AI and technology's place in society. This convening emerges from research I've been conducting over the last year with Dr. Tatiana Karayanis and Marie-Therese Peng, and I thank them both for their collaboration on this research and on the workshop planning. I also want to recognize the nearly 24 colleagues who've traveled here for the workshop or who bring to our meeting knowledge of these dynamics, AI, critical minerals, geopolitics, in the UK, Taiwan, Malaysia, Central Africa, including the DRC, in Latin America, including Ecuador, Chile, and Colombia, and across the United States. Before we proceed, let me also acknowledge the support of the organizations that made this research possible and this convening possible: the Ford Foundation, the Heising-Simons Foundation, and the Nelson Center for Collaborative Research here at the Institute for Advanced Study. Whenever I speak of AI, I offer this working definition adapted from the OECD: a machine-based system that infers from the input it receives how to generate outputs, including so-called predictions, recommendations, decision-making suggestions, content such as text, images, and sound, and forms of so-called reasoning. AI systems vary in their levels of autonomy and adaptiveness, and after deployment, some are static and others are iterative, and that is quite a wide world of tools and systems. When we turn to critical minerals, we encounter a kind of definitional challenge. Governments regularly revise their critical mineral lists based on changing geopolitical circumstances, supply vulnerabilities, and technological needs. Critical mineral classifications vary, with different countries and government agencies developing their own criteria, resulting in multiple, often conflicting lists of what materials are deemed essential at a given moment. This definitional flexibility is itself illuminating for scholars. It reveals that what counts as critical depends entirely on who's doing the counting, what they're counting toward, and how global power dynamics shift their strategic calculations. What we do know is this: the materials essential for AI infrastructure, including copper, lithium, cobalt, gallium, and a host of rare earth elements, are increasingly the subject of what political scientists Henry Farrell and Abraham Newman call weaponized interdependence. That is, countries are discovering that their control over critical resources can be wielded as instruments of geopolitical influence, turning economic dependencies into tools of statecraft, levers in trade wars, and weapons for national security. The contemporary dynamic recalls political economist and IAS School of Social Science faculty member Albert Hirschman's insights in his book, National Power and the Structure of Foreign Trade. His insights about how trade dependence can become political leverage, the notion that asymmetric economic relationships create opportunities for influence that extend far beyond commerce itself. Nations that once seemed peripheral to the cutting-edge technological advancement of today, many in the global south, now find themselves at the center of new forms of power, not because they've suddenly developed Silicon Valley-style innovation hubs, but because they sit atop the raw materials that make Silicon Valley possible. Indeed, the very AI we are told is supposed to dominate and drive our collective imaginations of the future with all of its promises, dreams, hypes, and nightmares, sits at the center of a transforming conception of global political economy. We are told this future begins and ends with what technologists call the AI stack. Semiconductors with semiconductors at the foundation, data centers in the middle, and various applications that many of us use at the surface. But researchers know, social scientists know, that every technological stack is also a social stack. And this particular stack extends far beyond the boundaries that engineers typically draw. My own work on the social dimensions of emerging technologies has consistently shown how innovations that appear purely technical are always embedded in broader systems of power, the market, and social relations, and AI proves no exception to this pattern. When we examine the full AI stack, the full AI ecosystem, we discover not just material dependencies, but human ones. For example, the data workers, many based in Africa and Asia, who label images, moderate content, and clean data sets that train AI systems, performing the invisible cognitive labor that makes machine learning possible. Consider the full architecture of AI dependency. A single large-scale data center requires over 1,000 tons of copper for its power networks, circuit boards, and cooling systems. The semiconductors that power machine learning demand gallium, germanium, and indium. The batteries that store energy for these operations need lithium and cobalt. Each of these minerals has a geography, a politics, a set of communities whose lives are reorganized around their extraction. When we map these dependencies honestly, the AI stack begins to look less like a technical diagram and more like what Kate Crawford calls in her revelatory book, Atlas of AI, a novel form of global empire, one that requires the subordination of landscapes and communities across the world to serve the computational ambitions of a relative few and the algorithmic aspirations of perhaps many. This reshuffling of global dependencies occurs against a backdrop that would have been unimaginable a few years ago. The current presidential administration's decision to freeze foreign aid and dismantle USAID represents more than budgetary politics, and it's certainly this. It signals the decline of a development and aid paradigm that has structured international relations for decades, including how scholars have typically conceived of and studied foreign affairs and global policy. What's more, the weakening of multilateral organizations from the United Nations to the World Trade Organization, institutions that, however flawed, at least gestured toward global cooperation, creates a vacuum in which new forms of power can emerge. Ironically, this happens just as the UN High-Level Advisory Board on Artificial Intelligence, on which I had the privilege to serve, released its Governing AI for Humanity report, calling for enhanced international cooperation and inclusive governance frameworks for AI. The report emphasized that AI's very power makes international cooperation essential, yet we find ourselves in a moment when such cooperation is increasingly difficult to achieve. In this context, starker truths about how technological advancement actually works are revealed. In US politics, we see Ukraine negotiating minerals for security deals and Greenland being eyed for territorial acquisition, not only because of its location, but also because of potential access to its critical mineral deposits. We see Chile's lithium salt flats transformed into industrial extraction zones, and the Democratic Republic of Congo, one of the planet's most resource-rich countries, finding itself simultaneously indispensable to and marginalized from the technological revolution it literally empowers. This geography of extraction extends crucially to communities within the United States as well. In Boxtown, a southwest Memphis neighborhood founded by formerly enslaved people, residents are witnessing the world's wealthiest man consume their air and water to power AI systems. The XAI facility operates 35 gas turbines without required pollution controls, likely making it the largest industrial polluter in Tennessee, in a community where cancer rates already exceed the national average by a factor of 4. Across Nevada's lithium-rich landscapes, we see a parallel pattern. an intensifying demand for natural and energy resources, giving rise to domestic extractivism, subordinating local environments and communities to serve distant computational needs. The social scientist in me is struck by how familiar all these patterns are and how novel. We have seen resource scrambles before, but never one quite like this. Previous waves of extraction, whether for gold, oil, or coltan for early electronics, occurred in a world where technological innovation and resource extraction seemed to operate separate spheres. Yet we can take account of history to understand these dynamics more deeply. Howard French's Born in Blackness offers one such historical lens. Reading it, one sees an account of gold in Africa, sometimes considered a critical mineral today, and certainly one in the past, even if it was not formally given this classification. And we see as well in his work the geopolitics that trade in gold unleashed across Africa and Europe. Today, the most cutting-edge technological development is directly dependent on some of the most traditional forms of extraction, creating what the sociologist Emanuel Wallerstein's world system theory would recognize as a new 21st century iteration of the core-periphery relationship. The countries that develop AI algorithms and deploy advanced models, the US, China, the European Union, occupy the technological core, while nations like the DRC, Chile, and Indonesia remain locked in peripheral roles as resource exporters, despite providing the myriad materials that make AI possible. This creates a temporal collusion between futures and pasts that defy our usual categories, where the most futuristic technologies depend on relationships that echo centuries-old patterns of extraction and dependency. What makes this moment particularly complex is that the same minerals powering AI development are essential for renewable energy infrastructure. Solar panels, wind turbines, and electrical vehicle batteries all depend on many of the same critical minerals that data centers require, creating what Theo Riofrancos calls an extractive appendage, which we will discuss this evening. A situation where multiple industrial transitions compete for the same finite resources, potentially intensifying rather than reducing environmental and social pressures on communities. Recent estimates suggest that the data centers powering AI will require an additional 1 million metric tons of copper by 2030. While each electric vehicle needs 4 times more copper than a traditional car. We are witnessing what industry observers call a vibe shift. The metal shortfall conversation has pivoted from electric vehicles to artificial intelligence as the primary driver for what some analysts now term the next critical mineral supercycle. McKinsey estimates that AI energy demand from data centers will explode from 17 gigawatts in 2022 to 35 gigawatts by 2030, a 10-fold increase over the mere 0.5% annual growth rate that grid planners had been forecasting. This creates new forms of competition between developers of technology that were supposed to be allies in building a sustainable future. The geopolitical implications of these dependencies are only beginning to unfold. China's dominance in critical mineral processing, controlling over 90% of global cobalt refining, for example, gives it leverage that exceeds far beyond traditional measures of national power. Resource-rich countries that have historically been positioned as aid recipients find themselves holding assets that Silicon Valley cannot do without. Yet this apparent shift in leverage often marks deeper continuities. While peripheral nations export physical materials, core countries export the far more valuable digital technologies, governance standards, and AI systems themselves. The traditional north-south flow of assistance is revealed to be, in many ways, a convenient fiction that obscures the south-to-north flow of essential materials, even as the most lucrative aspects of the AI value chain, algorithmic development, data processing, platform control, remain concentrated in the same handful of wealthy nations that have dominated previous technological revolutions. This reshuffling creates both dangers and opportunities. The danger lies in reproducing colonial patterns of extraction under new technological justifications, using the urgency of AI development, the urgency of geopolitical competition, the urgency of national security or climate transition to justify the subordination of communities and landscapes to distant needs. The opportunity lies in recognizing that this moment of technological transition might allow for more equitable arrangements if we can develop government's frameworks and true innovation adequate to the task. Given the AI industry's voracious appetite for materials, this reshuffling of global dependencies represents a moment of fundamental reimagining. How do we create engagement that is genuinely mutual rather than extractive? Is it possible to develop AI governance that acknowledges the full supply chain rather than focusing only on the visible technological surface? Can we imagine accountability mechanisms that trace responsibility from algorithm to mine, from data center to extraction site, perhaps using the participatory research strategies being developed by Tamara Nice? The panel that you're about to hear grapples with these questions from multiple angles, bringing together perspectives that rarely share the same table or the same stage. The goal is not to provide easy answers. I hope my remarks make clear that there are none. The problems we're discussing resist simple solutions, but to map the terrain more honestly, to understand what's actually at stake as AI reshapes global relations of power is important. Only by attending to the full AI stack, including its deeply material foundations, can we grasp the stakes of the future currently being configured. A comprehensive view is essential for envisioning alternative trajectories that might lead to more equitable and sustainable arrangements. The intensifying global demand for critical minerals is already catalyzing profound social and environmental transformations, whether or not they receive sustained analytical attention. The pressing question is what kind of change is unfolding, and whether we as researchers and as citizens can develop the conceptual frameworks and political imagination necessary to shape its course. The discussion we're beginning this afternoon is ultimately about an abiding focus on social research, power, who holds it, how it is exercised, and how it might be reimagined in the age of artificial intelligence. These are not merely technical questions about mining regulations or supply chains, although those are critically important, but fundamental questions about the kind of world that is being envisioned and developed through the use of AI, whether its development will be guided by principles of democratic governance, public accountability, and shared benefit. And ultimately, because our Earth's resources are rare and not inexhaustible, answering these questions requires independent research about whether and how AI development can be pursued sustainably. I'm now pleased to introduce our panelists and welcome them to the stage. We'll have about 45 minutes of conversation before opening the floor to questions. Tamara Nice is Director of Data and Society Research Institute's Climate, Technology, and Justice program. Previously, she led Data and Society's Algorithmic Impacts Lab, and formerly she was a researcher at the Green Software Foundation, as well as Director of Developer Engagement on the Green Software team at Intel. She was also previously a professor at the University of San Francisco. She received her PhD from the Department of Media, Culture, and Communication at New York University. Her work has been published in academic journals, including the International Journal of Communication and Social Media and Society, and in popular outlets including The Verge and Wired. She is the author of Death Glitch, How Techno-Solutionism Fails Us in This Life and Beyond, which was published by Yale University Press in 2023. Thea Riofrancos is an associate professor of political science at Providence College and a strategic co-director of the Climate and Community Institute. Her research focuses on resource extraction, renewable energy, climate change, the global lithium sector, green technologies, social movements, and the Latin American left. She is the author of the forthcoming Extraction, The Frontiers of Green Capitalism, which I had an opportunity to read the galley of and is quite amazing, comes out in September from Norton. She's also author of Resource Radicals, From Petro-Nationalism to Post-Extractivism in Ecuador, and co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal. Her publications have also appeared in scholarly journals such as Perspectives on Politics, as well as in media outlets including The New York Times, Financial Times, Foreign Policy, N+1, Dissent, and more. Howard W. French is professor at the Columbia University Graduate School of Journalism, a weekly international affairs columnist with Foreign Policy, and a foreign correspondent with The New York Times. serving as bureau chief in Africa, Central America, and the Caribbean, Japan, and China. He is the author of 6 books, including the forthcoming The Second Emancipation, Nkrumah, Pan-Africanism, and Global Blackness at High Tide, which comes out in August. His most recent book is Born in Blackness, Africa, Africans, and Making the Modern World, 1471 to the Second World War, which was a finalist for the Pulitzer Prize, I believe. Kate Crawford is a leading scholar of AI and its material impacts. She is a professor at the University of Southern California, a senior principal researcher at Microsoft Research, and was the inaugural visiting chair of AI and Justice at the École Normale Supérieure. Her book, Atlas of AI, was named Best Book of the Year by the Financial Times, won 3 international prizes, and has been translated into 12 languages. Her latest project with Vladan Joler, Calculating Empires, won the Grand Prize of the European Commission for Art and Technology, the Silver Lion at the Venice Biennale in the 2025, and the Silver Lion at the 2025 Venice Biennale, excuse me. Time named Crawford one of the world's most influential people in AI. Welcome, our speakers. Thank you. So thank you all for being here. Lots to discuss. I wanted to begin by just asking a question about your particular work and what your work sort of brings to this conversation about what's too often hidden about AI. What's the thing that you study or that you think about that is part of this sort of bigger AI stack that I think that we need to begin to develop and think through? Tamara, why don't we start with you?
Thank you. Oh, it is on. Sorry. So I wanted to talk a little bit about a series that I recently put out through Data and Society Research Institute, which is the policy and research-focused nonprofit where I work. And the name of that series was The Cloud is Dead, Living with Legacies of Resource Extraction. And a lot of the purpose of that series for me was to tie together my interests in both the material aspects of AI and thinking about how histories of environmental injustice shape the communities that are dealing with technological development crises today. So how is speculation and innovation haunted by the past? And so I look at the ways in which the cloud really no longer can suffice as a metaphor for computing, particularly with data center expansion and the growth of AI infrastructures and the reliance on AI and a number of other resources. But it also points to the ways in which data infrastructures are always haunted by the past and by these relationships. And so I connect data extractivism and thinking about generative AI's abuses of labor and creative outputs to legacies of resource extraction through industrialization. And in my book, Death Glitch, I point to the different ways that digital platforms, including AI chatbots of the dead, rely on a series of material infrastructures, including servers and other material instantiations of computing, as well as on the maintenance and care labor performed by people who are left behind in order to maintain the digital simulacra of the dead through their chatbot avatars. And a lot of this is really about the fundamental disconnect between the real materiality of computing across the supply chain and the fantasy of a kind of digital immortality, which we see increasingly in very mainstream tech circles, with figures like Sam Altman and Elon Musk and Mark Andreessen, who all have fantasies about achieving a form of digital transcendence and immortality through technology. And so why is it that they are so obsessed with building physical infrastructures, including things like nuclear power facilities and mega data centers, in order to perpetuate their control of resources? So I think there's no way to talk about AI without really focusing on that relationship with materiality.
Thank you for that. Thea, over to you.
Yeah, so I would maybe just pick up on that last word, materiality, and kind of take us directly to a physical landscape that is imbricated in this broader network of production that Alondra laid out so nicely in her opening remarks. So where my research started and where I like to kind of ground most of my kind of interventions is by taking us to the Atacama Desert of Chile. So this is a desert in northern Chile. It's the world's oldest desert, and it's also the second driest place on Earth after a subregion of Antarctica. So it's a very climatically and ecologically unique space, and also has its own role in like the history of life on the planet of Earth. I'll get there in a moment. But in the Atacama Desert, which is where I started this research, it's an extractive frontier, a concept that we'll work with a bit today. It contains a third of the world's known lithium reserves and supplies about 20% of global lithium supply. And lithium, I'll talk more about this later, is one of the many key minerals that relates to kind of digital technologies as well as to the energy transition. And so we could say that like one starting point for artificial intelligence is the Atacama Desert, right? And, you know, I want to kind of bring in some of the science fiction and oftentimes fantastic and speculative ways that that digital technologies are portrayed as kind of like disembodied, right? And I want to say that even in the Atacama Desert itself, even though it is a physical place, you get these portrayals because it has a very otherworldly kind of vibe to it. You go there and there are comparisons made of Mars, of the moon, just because the landscape, like there are these enormous salt flats that are white and rocky and surrounded by these enormous Andean mountains. You know, you don't really see anything that looks like what we might recognize as like organic life in some of these places. And yet, in the actual brine pools where the subsurface brine, where all of this lithium is, there are microorganisms that live in the actual brine ponds, right? And so even in the deposit itself, which is in this case a liquid lithium deposit that is pumped to the surface and arrayed on these massive evaporation ponds, it is itself a habitat teeming with life. And scientists are still at the very early stages of discovering what microorganisms, how they connect to the broader web of life, what scientific value they might have, what pharmacological value they might have, right? And so, you know, this place that is on the one hand an extractive frontier is on the other hand a habitat for microorganisms, for beautiful flamingos, and also for humans, right? And so living around this enormous salt flat, the one that I just mentioned, the Atacama salt flat, which is about 2/3 of the size of the state of Rhode Island, where I live, so it's enormous, live 18 indigenous communities, right, who are also themselves often kind of erased from depictions of the landscape, which is, you know, speaking of Howard's work and some of Alondra's comments, there's a long-standing colonial depiction of deserts in general and of this desert in particular as totally empty of human life. Like the explorers, quote unquote, the conquerors from Spain that first went there said, we don't see anyone and it's also way too dry to live here. There were people living there for thousands of years that had constructed intricate irrigation systems to support not only human life but agriculture, right? And so I think there's this way in which when you go to the beginning of the supply chain, a lot comes undone, right, about how we think about what counts as technology, what we think about what an extractive frontier means, and how many different meanings and significations and also just material realities one place can hold.
Thank you. Fantastic. So Howard, been learning from you, reading your work forever, and have been so delighted for you to sort of begin to be thinking about contemporary technology, including, I would commend to the audience this beautiful essay that you wrote in the New York Review of Books recently on Alvin Toffler and China and his the influence of his futurism on China. So what say you about the sort of hidden economy of AI?
Thank you very much, Alondra. Thank you for having us. Thank you for putting this on. I've been able to see some old friends here, which was a delight and surprise in a couple of cases. I'm probably the odd person out on this panel in the sense that I have the least explicitly to do with AI among the people gathered on the stage. So I'm not speaking as an expert about AI in any capacity. My only expertise is really as a curious user and reader, right? But I do know something about Africa, and I'm going to talk to you about Africa for a few minutes and talk to you in a way that picks up on a word that Alondra used in her address, that word being continuity. And I'm going to put what's happening with minerals and AI in Africa in a continuous framework in terms of the rest of the world's relationship with Africa, and in particular the West's relationship because it's so long with Africa. I was a correspondent for the New York Times in West and Central Africa from 1994 to 1998. That was my second stint as a journalist in Africa, the first time I was a freelancer. One of the people in the audience who I had pleasure of connecting with again is Peter Rosenblum, who was working in then Zaire when I showed up. I think it was 1994. And he knew, he's probably still I'm going to take the probably out of this. He knows more about Congo now than I know now, and certainly knew a lot more than I did when I showed up. Anyway, what struck me immediately was how totally political chaos and eventually warfare in the Congo, then Zaire, mapped onto matters of resource exploitation and extraction. And this lesson was repeated in various places around the continent as I traveled as a journalist. In Liberia, there were a variety of minerals, and then there was the vast portion of the country that's devoted to, and has for a very long time been devoted to rubber production. That's a form of extraction. In Ghana, gold exploitation that has very old roots, which I explore in my book, Born in Blackness, but which is dominated now by big multinationals. Southeastern Nigeria, various very delicate ecosystems, sort of wetlands and lagoon systems that contain some of the richest oil deposits in the world, totally devastated by extraction there. Niger, a country upon which France has historically depended for most of its uranium supply for its nuclear power industry. I could go on and on. Everywhere I went, there were political troubles. Almost everywhere I went where there was violence or chaos or unrest, which is sort of the superficial label that we journalists slapped onto these things. If you scratched a little bit, you could find resource problems at their root, right? I want to speak to you for the rest of my remarks about the Congo, and it's not about a mineral, although actually I covered a war in the Congo, which was in part about coltan, which is a mineral that's been in the news a lot with regard to mobile phone manufacture. But I want to talk to you about something older, right? And this gets at continuities. I went to a place in 1998 in central-ish Zaire, still Zaire then, named Mbuji-Mayi, a famous mining town. And I was looking at how Mobutu, then the dictator of the Congo, sorry, I call it the Congo, but it was Zaire, so I'm stressing a little bit about being accurate, historically speaking. Anyway, he was the dictator of the country now called the Congo, again called the Congo, right? And he was financing himself, in part, through exploitation of diamonds. And Mbuji-Mayi was the capital then of the diamond trade. And so I went to look at what how the diamond trade was organized in Mbuji-Mayi, and I spent a few days wandering around. I hired a local driver and a car, and I just sort of minded other people's business, poked into markets, went out into the fields here and there, and I finally settled onto an auction scene at a place where once a week people who have been digging for diamonds come with bags, literally sacks of rocks that they have dug up, and they sell them to comptoirs, which are buyers who have take a quick look at them, weigh them, and offer a price to the people who have been suffering digging into the earth for usually weeks at a time. Anyway, there was a place that caught my attention because of the name on the shack, and the name was "Diamonds Are Us." In English. And so I approached Diamonds Are Us, and I met the proprietor of this business, and he told me his story. And his name was Nzambi. And he said that he had started out as a goat herder. He had a herd of 300 goats, and he sold his goats and was able to, he got a few $1,000s from goats, and then he decided he could get into the diamond mining business with this capital that he had accumulated from liquidating his herd. And so he bought up. He went to the marketplace where I was, and with no prior experience in this business, bought up as much as he could with his several $1,000s from the goat herd. Well, it turns out he strikes gold, not literally gold. He strikes diamonds. So he spent, I think the figure was $3,000, and in the little sacks that these diggers had accumulated, he ends up with a huge return. I think it's over $20,000. So he's invested $3,000. He gets $20,000 plus dollars just by luck. The quality of the rocks that were inside of these bags turns out to have been quite good, and so he sells it upmarket and gets a big profit. Okay, so Nzambi continues to explain his life to me and how everything is organized, and the succession of titles that he has accumulated as a result of his rising success. So when you begin to buy things and make money from buying diamonds, as he had done, you are called, in the curious lingo of the Congo or of Zaire back then, you're called something that has a bad ring to it. In English, or in French for that matter, trafiqueur, which means trafficker, right? So, but to be a trafficker is better to be a digger. Trafficker has a bit of a shine to it, right? So Nzambi had become a traffiqueur, a successful traffiqueur. He had made good on his initial investment, and unlike a lot of people, mining throughout history, wildcat mining throughout history is usually about boom and bust. People at the individual or collective level, things almost always go bad. Well, Nzambi had been very prudent, and he was not spending his fortune profligately. He was reinvesting it. And he had many crews now who were working for him full time out in the fields, digging and digging and digging. And he had gotten so rich now as a result of this that he had acquired another title. People began to call him and this is a little bit strange to the English ear, an évolué, which means an evolved person. It turns out this is a term with some pedigree in Congolese history. Under Belgian colonial rule, an évolué was a rare status given to a very small number of Africans who were considered by the Belgians to have sort of passed the test of European civilization. So Nzambi, unselfconsciously, very proudly, is calling himself and being called by others an évolué because of the success that he had achieved in terms of this trafficking business of his. And so I went around town. I spent a few days there. I met a few other people like him, nobody who had hit it off quite as well as he had. But it sort of, it was explained to me in a variety of conversations that how just enough people succeeded at this business to keep the hamster wheel turning. In other words, most people who make this initial find and get a killing end up, it's like a casino, you end up losing your money. But enough people don't lose their money or don't lose their money quickly enough to discourage newcomers from trying their hand at this. And this is the nature of the extraction business at the artisanal level throughout Africa, that there's just enough of a shine of success and enough of these examples of people who are making a breakthrough to keep other people willing actually to literally work themselves to death, to dig deeply into the earth to the point of actually suffocating or falling victim to mine collapses, because they've seen the example of the guy who's got the fleet of Land Rovers or who pulls up to Diamonds Are Us in a Mercedes, and which Nzambi was doing, right? And so this is how the economy of this sort of thing works in Africa. And I'm quite certain in Indonesia and New Guinea and many other places. This casino sort of style operation in the aggregate, the house always wins in the casino, but there's enough people winning at any given time to encourage this thing along, right? And so as I was leaving town by chance, late one afternoon, a guy driving a nice car himself, a local guy, stops me. He stops alongside of me. I'm walking down the street, and he says to me, he didn't know my name, but I was pretty obviously a journalist. He said, "I have some questions for you, Mr. Journalist." And he said, "Why is it that people are allowed to suffer on a global scale like this. This is a guy who could see the big picture. He says, this is so obviously wrong. Why is it that the world allows this to happen? And so this is the question I want to end with and to leave with you, and presumably we can find some space to discuss it. Before I end, though, I want to return to continuities and to say this. The minerals that we're discussing here are a small piece of a much bigger extractive history in Africa. And in Born in Blackness, I tell how this extractive history begins with gold. You alluded to gold in your introductory remarks. It was not slavery that drove the Portuguese and other Europeans down the coast of West Africa in the 15th century. It was gold. And slavery, or buying human beings to traffic them first to Europe and then to other parts of the world, began only as a way of financing the search for gold. The Portuguese were very poor, they were the leaders in this thing, and so they figured out in the wake of the Black Death in Europe, manpower shortages and labor all over the place, they could sell Africans into Lisbon and into Spain at a profit sufficient to keep financing their search for gold. Anyway, 100 years later, slavery takes over as the big business. And in the 16th century, by which time the Portuguese have sort of locked on to Angola, which becomes their, I'm going to end, their biggest source of slaves. The Portuguese figure there are enough Africans here to be extracted into the New World to last us until the end of time. In writing this book, I found a memo to the Portuguese crown which actually used that phrase. There's enough here to last us until the end of time. The enough was about human beings. Today we're thinking about minerals used for AI. Is there enough to last us till the end of time, or to the end of our computing desires, or until the end of the fantasies of these people who think that they're going to achieve immortality? Somehow I doubt it. I'll stop there. Thank you, Alondra.
Thank you, Howard. It was fascinating to hear from you about your reporting, but also you raise a really important point about opportunities for social mobility for some people, the casino aspect that participate in this political economy, and also that the political economy is not only just large mining enterprises, right? Like, so we know in Congo, for example, that there's quite a lot of artisanal coltan mining, for example, and there's a whole sort of economy of that intersects with kind of large-scale multinational mining. So it's important to remember that as well. Kate, let me come to you next and just sort of ask you to sort of maybe set the stage for us as we kind of talk more specifically about AI. I mean, certainly my first thinking about the material, I mean, your book, Atlas of AI, the material mapping of the things that bring AI into the world come from from your book and your research and your work on this. For someone who hasn't thought about their smartphone or their AI as connected to mining or other resource extraction, although I know there's been, campaigns to help people know this, can you talk us through a kind of, walk us through your map, might be one to say. How do we think about how critical mineral extraction works in the AI supply chain? And then I'm also interested in what you are discovering kind of 5 years out, several years out from your book, about the scale and scope of material extraction for AI that we didn't understand, before your book was published or a few years ago, as the scale of this industry is expanding.
Well, thank you, Alondra, and I just want to say I'm so glad that you're hosting this event with Tatiana and Marie-Therese. Thank you all. It's such an urgent time to be having this conversation. Honestly, for me, the moment where, as somebody who's been in the AI field for a long time, where I realized that AI was, in fact, an extractive industry, came about 10 years ago. And it started on a project that I was doing with Vlad Anjola, where we decided to map the full life cycle of a single AI consumer device. We started with the Amazon Echo. I'm just curious, who here has an Amazon Echo in their home or has seen one? Okay, most people know what it is, okay, and several people have one. So we were really interested in taking this somewhat, anonymous sort of beige cylinder that many people have sitting in their kitchen or in their bedroom, and really understanding where it all comes from. Obviously, we were very familiar with the data layer, how voices are extracted and analyzed, but we opened these systems up and wanted to understand every single component. What mine does this piece come from? What is the smelting process? Where are the container ships actually taken from, and where do they go? And then what happens at the end of life of these systems? They're generally only used for 3 to 4 years, and then they're thrown away in e-waste tips in places like Ghana and Pakistan. And in doing this work, it took us sort of 2 years to map sort of the full life cycle of this one device. It absolutely changed me as a researcher, as a professor. That deep lived experience of the material realities of these systems, it blew me away, particularly because artificial intelligence is so commonly misunderstood as being immaterial, as abstract, as code in the cloud, when in fact, the opposite is the case. It is one of the most resource-intensive architectures on this planet. In fact, I saw that just last week, Sam Altman was saying that AI is currently the largest infrastructure project in the world. And I think that's about right. Certainly the fieldwork that I've done over the last decade in mines, in data centers, in AI factories where crowd workers are labeling data sets, all the way through to what happens in terms of the front end of generative AI that tells you nothing about this extraordinary planetary machine of extraction behind it. So I think in many ways that project back in 2015, 2016 was really the grounding for me, because it was called Anatomy of an AI System. And in doing that, I realized that I wanted to shift in scale from studying a single device to studying the entire industry. And that became, this enormous kind of global project that became Atlas of AI. And in doing so, in sort of studying the data layer, the material layer, the labor layer, I in many ways got to see the laying of a foundation that is really starting to bear fruit now for the sector, because that sort of very early stage has now been accelerated 100-fold in what is called generative AI. And the amount of energy, the amount of water, the amount of minerals, and the amount of labor, particularly low-paid labor in the global south, the extraordinary acceleration across each one of these domains is staggering. In fact, Alondra and I have just been talking about not just the recent reports that are showing, of course, that generative AI is currently using as much energy as the nation of Japan and is projected to use as much energy as the nation of India by 2034. But on top of that, it's using an enormous amount of drinking water. Very few people realize, in fact, there was a spectacular study that came out just last year that showed that a usual exchange with ChatGPT, say 20 back and forth, is about the equivalent of pouring a half liter of water onto the ground, just going to waste. And why is that? Well, it's because these large-scale, what are called hyperscale data centers, use an enormous amount of drinking water to cool those heat-producing GPUs. Now, many of these architectures are, shamefully not designed for sustainability. There are many ways in which these systems are really built for a race, which is how quickly can we build AI, how fast can we get it out there, and how can we participate in what is now framed as a geopolitical race that Alondra mentioned in her comments. This is such a damaging framework because it is a sort of a permission note to really do anything that you want in terms of extraction at scale, exploitation of populations, and of course, the mass harvesting of data. So, when we look at these clean, banal, interfaces that say, what do you want today? Just type in your prompt. Behind that lies this extraordinary system and also this history of which Howard so powerfully spoke. It is built on centuries of colonial systems that are still very present today. They haven't gone anywhere. So in many ways, this is an extractive industry that has built and continues to build on the extractive systems of many centuries that have really, we're now seeing the worst types of exploitation, but hidden behind these very banal interfaces.
Thank you for that, Kate. I mean, it always, hearing you just map it out, and also you should know that, part of Kate's work is literal mapping, this kind of art projects and exhibitions that sort of help us to see, although the scale of them, you can't even hardly take them in, this work. So I hope that you will see some of this work when it's being exhibited. So Thea, I want to come to you next. And so you've got this incredible book, Extraction, that's coming out in September. And reading advanced copy of it, the thing I really appreciated and learned from you was how we're navigating this kind of incredible tension, right? So you introduced the concept of what you call the extractive appendage, in which we are simultaneously extracting more fossil fuels than ever before, and we need more critical minerals for AI and green technologies than ever before. And we hope that the green technologies are supposed to help us be more sustainable, and yet the critical minerals from the AI are probably taking us in a kind of reverse direction. And so how does this kind of growing appetite, the scale of which that Kate laid out nicely for copper, lithium, et cetera, fit into this tension of this extractive appendage and what you call green capitalism? And are there solutions that can sort of reduce some of these extractive pressures? Or are we just kind of careening towards, I don't know, devastating the planet, dare I say?
I won't answer that question. I think we know the answer. So there's a lot in there. I want to kind of break it down into a few pieces. And I also want to preface that, similar to Howard, I don't work on AI, but I've been invited into these spaces recently, and it's been a real opportunity to learn about how the materiality of what I work on, which is electric vehicle and lithium battery supply chains, intersects very directly and/or replicates and/or is in parallel to or on top of, right? So the reason I use appendage is for us to think about the way that these material systems are layered and sedimented and kind of grafted onto one another, right? So the metaphor is meant to be sort of literal in that sense. So let's think about kind of the AI extraction nexus. Kate already laid this out for us in sort of broad planetary scale. I'm going to just focus on lithium for now, right? And so why is lithium, which we hear about more in terms of our batteries for our cars, for our laptops, that sort of thing, and we might not immediately know how it's relevant to artificial intelligence, but what batteries do is they allow for energy storage, right? That's the kind of amazing thing that batteries perform, regardless of the type of batteries, and lithium batteries are particularly efficient at that. And so with the data centers that power AI, but also our financial transactions, cloud storage, all sorts of digital systems, energy storage is very important, because if there's a power outage for a moment, what you want is the seamless connectivity, as Kate said, the smooth interface, right? So in a world of all sorts of disruptions, I mean, any grid can be disrupted, but in a world of climate crisis, geopolitical crisis, ecological crisis, right? There are lots of pressures on grids and lots of moments where suddenly everything could go offline and cause a major financial crisis, for example, right? Not just interrupting someone using ChatGPT for their homework, but really create a major issue. So the batteries are important to ensure 24/7 power, right? And just thinking about the entire material infrastructure just to support 24/7 power operations, right? And so what Google recently proclaimed is that they now have reached their threshold of 100 million battery cells just for their AI servers, right? That's one company, it's a subset of what they do, 100 million battery cells, right? So what this tells us is that the supply chains for artificial intelligence begin in extractive frontiers like the Atacama Desert, right? The same processes that I mentioned of this mass mining, the ecological and water impacts that has there, and along with many other extractive zones around the planet, are feeding into the system. So in short, AI creates, because of its need for 24/7 power, demand for new critical minerals. But it's also, and this is where it was interesting to sort of do this research, it also is relevant on the supply side. So it's not just that AI needs minerals, so it's demand, it also is helping create new extractive frontiers, right? And so some of the cutting edge technology in the mining sector is around using artificial intelligence to help identify deposits, to help map them, to kind of narrow down what are called hot zones, where you have a lot of different deposits simultaneously occurring, to help identify drill sites, and then the physical drilling happens, and then the money making and deal making happens, and those deposits will be sold, to a large mining company, right? But one of the things that artificial intelligence mining companies boast, not just that they can search much more expansively using decades of geological data and entering them into these systems, which then require all the water and the energy, right? So it's a very, it's always happening on both ends, but also that they can dramatically reduce the cost of exploration, right? So that means you're getting rid of human labor, right? So then there's all these other implications for all the human communities that Howard drew our attention to, and that Tamara also is talking about, right? Like the human labor that goes into this is then simultaneously being eliminated by the use of AI-driven prospecting, surveying, exploration, right? And just to kind of close this out, I want to come back to the extractive appendage, because this entire thing is then in turn extremely energy intensive, right? We already learned a bit about this, but currently in the US, there's a major surge of new fossil, and I use it advisedly, fossil gas. We often call it natural gas. That is an industry term. We should call it fossil gas because it is a fossil fuel, right? So fossil gas power plants are now experiencing a resurgence. We thought we were maybe in this energy transition moment, right? Where we could increasingly power with clean energy, with solar, wind, et cetera. But instead, because of the sudden and dramatic energy needs of all of these data centers, we're seeing kind of a renewed expansion of fossil-powered power plants. And all of that means more fossil fuel extraction, right, to feed those power plants, right? So in short, AI needs minerals, it finds minerals, and it also requires the combustion and therefore extraction of fossil fuels. And it's just such a density of different materialities that are in some cases, and we could do this atlas and mapping work, happening in the same zones. The fossil fuels are being extracted, the critical minerals are being extracted, right? The climate and ecological impacts of all of that are being felt, right? For then supply chains quite distant from those places to provide 24/7 access to artificial intelligence, banking, finance, shopping, and all of the things that we rely on AI for.
Thank you, Thea, for that. So Tamara, I'm going to come to you, and then we'll go back to Howard. So you work on, in part, labor and digital supply chains. What new forms of labor and social relations are you seeing in your work? Thea started to lay some of these out already.
Yeah, no, it's a perfect segue, actually. So my current research projects, one of which is funded by the National Science Foundation, and the other which is funded by the Internet Society Foundation, are using participatory methods to look at the different ways that communities are being impacted by AI and related energy infrastructures and other practices of resource extraction. But a lot of my work is also very much focused on the ways that tech companies are thinking about corporate governance, are thinking about corporate social responsibility, sustainability reports like ESG reports, and other forms of compliance, as well as responsible AI practices in-house. And what I spend a lot of time doing is talking to developers and other people within large tech companies and trying to connect their modes of evaluation and understanding, say, the carbon cost of a particular AI model or its water cost, and weighing energy and water versus other resource metrics, but then also trying to look at the health impacts that communities are dealing with on the ground, the role of pollution from natural gas powered power plants, and all of the other issues that we know are swirling within the popular press right now. And I think what we're noticing in the course of doing this research is the way that there's been a reconfiguration around labor. So right now, even developers, even people within large tech companies, feel that their labor is under threat. Increasingly, senior developers are being asked to do their coding work with Copilot instead of hiring junior devs, instead of hiring interns. And so the idea that we can now replace labor altogether with AI is a fantasy that the industry is, of course, willing to kind of run with in order to save money. But it also is maybe creating an opening for tech workers across the supply chain in different parts of the tech company, across the enterprise, and in different parts of the world to think about what is happening, over there. And so I know that there are campaigns right now on the part of chip workers for responsible mining who are trying to activate Apple workers and Intel workers, people who work in the semiconductor industry, to really think about their relationship to what's happening in Congo, to really make that connection between human rights and labor violations and the work that they're doing every day. And so what I'm seeing right now is a much bigger opening for making these connections. And I think that we can do that through having these multi-stakeholder kinds of conversations. So having a lot of different people in the room from different disciplinary perspectives, from different companies, and create a space where people can speak freely and not worry about NDAs and not worry about getting fired. How do you create the correct kind of social platform for people to feel comfortable really talking about these critical issues in an open way? And I do think that some of the changes in labor right now because of generative AI, so the fact that it may be coders too who are under threat and not only creative workers, is actually in this one very small way kind of useful, at least in this moment. So I think we need to jump on this moment and really try to foster as much cross-industry and interdisciplinary conversation as we can.
I mean, in sociology, we'd call it a political opportunity structure, this kind of moment that you're pointing to in which different types of workers see themselves kind of aligned with others. So, Howard, I want to come to you, because I think one of the things I was trying to capture in my remarks is how, not only for scholars, but for the public, the rhetoric around AI captures, colonizes our imagination around how the world works. And I think so much of your work has really been helping us see the world anew. So Born in Blackness is sort of, one way of thinking it, saying it in the context of the conversation today is, we thought power and value flowed this way, but actually it flows this way. And so I guess my question for you is to sort of talk us through, research that kind of is reframing conventional ways of thinking about how the world works, and what advice would you have for us as we go into a workshop that's bringing people who've been working in conflict minerals and who are specialists in Latin America and Africa, who to a person says, I don't know anything about AI, with scholars who are working on AI. How can you help us with our reimagining?
That's a tall task.
But I know you can do it because I've been reading you for years.
I'm sort of thrust into deeper despair by this conversation than even I had been on its eve, right? I want to pick up on things that my co-panelists have said here. Kate mentioned this permission node, right? And I think that's a very powerful way to speak about what's going on now. This notion that whatever the we means, right? That we can't allow some other, usually the most prominent and consistent other is China, but the we can't allow the other to win this race is the nature, it's the foundation of this permission node, right? And I think we have to put the names of the minerals aside for a moment in understanding where this leads and thinking about history. And I'm not here to plug my own book, but I connect with this in a way that I think comes back to your question again in a note to the Portuguese crown by people who were involved in the enslavement of Africans in the 17th century, who had glommed onto Angola as this incredibly rich place in terms of the supply of human bodies, right? Which were necessary for the construction of modernity, for the construction of the New World, for the enrichment of Europe. This note said the following. It said that the continuing construction of Brazil requires the constant destruction of Angola. The continuing construction of Brazil is a permission note. We have a mandate. Our mandate is no matter what, we have to develop Brazil, because if we don't, the Spanish or the English or somebody else will snatch it away from us and we will lose. We are in a parallel kind of situation right now. And it terrifies me. And when I said I don't have an answer for you, it's because I see that this kind of same human logic of self authorization is at play for some vague goals with enemies that are raised like specters to justify whatever it is that you would like to justify. Like, what does it mean actually to lose the AI race? What's actually being lost? We need to talk about that.
But you did exactly what I asked you to do, actually, which was to actually, so much of our challenge is like, how do we reframe the conversation that's happening? And not only for public sentiment, but also for the kind of questions that we pose and the research that we do. So thank you for doing that. So let me ask one final question of the group. I'll ask all the same question, and then we'll open up for Q&A with the audience. So we are obviously living through a moment when kind of old rules about international relations, I raised kind of, those of us who work in the space of international relations, policy, et cetera, have relied upon and often critiqued a kind of standard development paradigm, aid paradigm for a very long time, and that is just kind of crumbling for all sorts of reasons, not all of them bad, around us. So it's a time for, I think, to sort of rebuild. So to each of you, what would you do if you had real power to reshape how AI development is happening? What are the kind of most urgent questions that you think we could actually change how we understand how this new kind of geopolitical moment is working? What interventions would you suggest? How would you move from sort of documenting these problems as you do in your work to sort of actually changing who benefits from these developments? So kind of blue sky question for all of you. And why don't we start with you, Tamara?
Sure. So probably will come of no surprise, but I will say collective action, unions across industry, across the supply chain, uniting workers at different levels. And also, it has to be a global effort. So part of what we're seeing with the way that policy is happening now when it comes to regulating data centers, for example, is the problem of a data center moratorium in one state in the US or one region in the world ends up displacing that problem to another location. So the need for actual international conversations, the development of standards, sure, but also of really opening the door for sharing strategies across sites. And I think, there's no way to build AI or technology in general in the public interest if we don't radically reshape wealth inequality. And so I don't see how AI can be constructed in a way that isn't detrimental to our collective future if we don't radically shift the imbalance of power. So that's what I would do first.
Thank you for that. So Thea, and I hope I'm going to press on you to sort of, if you don't mind, do the kind of IR development aid question just because of where you sit, disciplinary, and the kind of fairly radical work that you do for your disciplinary training.
Yeah, so I'll speak a little to that, and then I'll get to solutions, because there are some, they're hard to implement, and they require solidarity and collective action and coordination, but they're out there. So, but yeah, let me, it's interesting. I was reading, I read a Financial Times headline like a couple weeks ago that said, data centers remain troublingly reliant on Chinese lithium. And I was just like, I've read this headline 8,000 times about 8,000 different other things that are troubly reliant on China. So the geopolitical framing, and I really love your reframing, like what does it even mean to win this race, or why is it bad to be reliant? Like why is dependency actually always coded as negative, which I think has a very interesting history and a kind of split one. And I'm only indulging this because Alondra kind of gave me the prompt for it, but there's a long history in the global south, and especially Latin America, but very much so Africa, the Middle East, South Asia, of thinking of dependency as the position that colonized places are put into. They are rendered dependent, and this was said very nicely in Alondra's comments, like from the moment of brutal conquest onward, they are put in a position where their entire economies are dependent on decisions made by powerful people elsewhere, right? So dependency in this framework, and this was a language that gelled in the 60s and 70s, was a critical terminology. But what's really interesting is that the West co-opted that, actually directly in response to that moment. So they're like, oh, the third world thinks like they're the dependent ones. Well, actually, we're the dependent ones because we depend on them for our raw materials, and that's bad. And so we need to like control those raw material flows better. We need to also have some of our own domestic raw material flows. So this is when in the 70s, we get the turn to like, we should have more fossil fuel extraction in the US, in the North Sea of the UK, right? So these kind of domestic frontiers within the global north start getting really expanded in order to, quote unquote, reduce reliance on the global south, the then third world, right? And these then get kind of recapitulated at every moment that there's an energy crisis or a raw material crisis. Global south folks say, like, we want to escape this position of dependency, of being just like export and extraction zones. And the global north says, well, we need to be less dependent on you all, which then usually involves new forms of subordination, right? So it's really interesting how that word kind of recurs across this global south-north binary. But I'm going to zoom ahead for a moment and just give a couple of solution-y things and maybe help with Howard's depression a little bit, maybe not. But you know, I think of it in kind of three categories, and I'm translating this from my work on green technologies, but I think it applies, and some things that Kate and Tamara said make me feel like confident that it somewhat applies. And you know, the three things are grassroots protests along extractive frontiers, system design from a sustainability perspective, so I'm picking up on what you were saying, and south-south coordination. And I'll just give a sentence to each, and this can be food for thought, and we can mingle and talk about it afterwards. But grassroots protests, I just want to name that there is, you know, we may not, people in the room may or may not be aware of this, but there is a tremendous amount of anti-mining protests, especially in Latin America, but it's going global in many ways, right? And so what I mean by that is militant protest that says we are going to defend our land, our water, our rights, our ancestral territory, our ecosystems against this predation of extraction, and we're going to do so militantly, meaning we're going to put our bodies in front of a bulldozer or something like that, right? And so this grassroots protest has been really interesting. It's not just a local phenomena, it's very transnationally networked. And it's been effective. Like when I go to mining industry conferences, they're very concerned about the level of protest and about its kind of radical ambition. A second thing that I want to mention is that, you know, we can't just expect people in the global south, whether through protest or through governance, to like make mining better or to reduce it. We also have to think about how do we design systems from the beginning so they are less materially intensive. And there's so much to do in this regard. So the think tank that I work with, Climate and Community Institute, has done some modeling that shows that we could have a completely zero emissions transportation system with radically less mining of lithium and of all of the other critical minerals as well that you can kind of extrapolate to if we just even marginally reduce how many cars we use in the US, right? And we move to transit and walking and other forms of electric shared mobility, right? And so there are ways to design systems at the outset that really shrink their material footprint and give other societies on Earth room to breathe and govern their own resources, because we're not just rapaciously draining them. We, I mean affluent folks in the global north, just to be specific. And then the last thing, I think picking back on the 70s moment that I was referring to with that critical intervention from the global south of dependency theory and this language of dependency, is that there is, I think, a real renewal in this moment, and honestly I would say a need for increasing what is called South coordination. And what that means is countries within the global south, Africa, Latin America, South Asia, right, coordinating among one another within their regions, but also across those regions to say, like, what would it look like for the world to be provisioned for our needs, right? What would it look like for our regions to keep the resources here and use them for our own supply chains to meet the human needs that we have on our own continents for clean energy, for mobility, for digital, you know, for digital access, right? Instead of, again, this model in which our resources are taken from us and go far away, right? So this requires real coordination because the power scales, as Howard has laid out, are centuries old. And so in order to get the leverage of what really is the world's majority, folks need to engage in collective action and coordinate. And honestly, very interestingly, the history of OPEC, you know, not the greatest organization these days, but back in the day, was an example of South-South coordination to really rewrite the rules of the oil market. And there are discussions now, like, could some of this be relevant in critical minerals, right? To kind of really put that leverage on the table of the global south is where this stuff is coming from. You know, what if we used our power as the resource holders to really reset the rules of the global game?
Thank you for that, Howard.
So I agree with what Tamara said about inequality being a really important feature of this problematic that we're discussing, and I think inequality operates at lots of different levels, right? internationally, north-south, domestically, even within communities domestically and all the rest. And it's, woefully unexamined as a factor in our lives for big ticket problems like this and for many other things, right? I'm not dismissing Thea's recommendation about finding bridges between global South societies and solidarity on various bases of like cope. We're both producers of this or that. I think that absolutely needs to be done. I agree that OPEC is kind of has an interesting history, but I'm not altogether optimistic that a center can be created that holds, if I can balderize some poetry, right? In that regard. Africa, just to take that one continent, is incredibly balkanized, and keeping Africans together behind any one thing, just at that level, has been, historically speaking, extremely difficult. I think what I would suggest is that we, and this might be the most utopian thing you hear today, that we figure out a way to address this othering thing that I talked about earlier. That, the big other right now for this society is China. And I don't want to place this all on Americans. America definitely others China. I've lived in China quite a bit also. Chinese society also others other people, including America as well. Problems like this, problems like global warming, they're not going to be solved. They're not going to be ameliorated unless we can reduce the other factor in our calculations and begin to privilege much more what we have in common. We have in common that we're all human beings. There's one planet that we've all inherited together, and that we have to be good shepherds of it, right?
You've lifted right out of your depression and taken us to the higher heights, Howard.
We're not on that road right now, right? And getting on that road's not going to be easy, right? I used in my previous comment this thing from Portugal about the continuous destruction of Angola, right? That's the road we're on. The global north, and China too, is willing to, in the name of this competition, to run roughshod over the entire rest of the world, if necessary, in order to be first in whatever they decide it's important to be first in. And that's just not a dynamic that is going to benefit actually anybody in the long run.
Same question to you, Kate, and you're going to wind us down here before we go to Q&A, but I also wanted to ask you about the new work. So you didn't publish Atlas of AI and sort of leave the topic alone. You've continued to do this incredible mapping work. So I would love for you to talk about future prospects, but also talk about what you've been doing and what you see, where we're going.
Well, I think first I'm going to try and take on Howard's question, which is so important and provocative, of what happens if we lose the AI race. And I think we have to ask that question, because right now the answer is being given purely in terms of national security, that this is a military race, and that if we lose, then we lose everything. And this particular framing is extraordinarily powerful in DC right now, as I know Alondra knows very well. But it is, of course, now enabling an extraordinary set of decisions that simply were not even on the radar 3 years ago. You might have seen that several of the CEOs of AI companies all signed a document together 2 weeks ago saying that please do not put restrictions on our ability to extract data from everybody, or it means that China will win the AI war, and this will have enormous national security implications. So it's really being used as the sort of the ultimate trump card, if I may, in saying why these systems must be completely uncontrolled, unregulated, and absolutely given all of the resources that are absolutely possible. Now, like Howard, I think this is really important to understand in a historical context. So I think one of the solutions, if I may, is to historicize the condition that we are in. This feels very new. It feels as though we are on the verge of something absolutely novel and extraordinary. It is not. It is a repetition of a pattern that we have seen over multiple industrial transformations over multiple centuries. So in a recent project that took me sort of 5 years of work looking at the processes of how empires have used new technologies to centralize power. We start in the 1500s and effectively map out sort of 500 years of these practices of militarization, automation, and enclosure. Of course, they're completely related, but this enclosure of public lands, this enclosure of labor, this enclosure of the public commons, be it of knowledge or of minerals, this is exactly what we've seen happen in the AI industry. And again, by putting it in that historical context, we remember that there are ways to fight back. There are things that we can do that are incredibly effective. So part of what really inspired me in doing this project for the last 5 years was seeing where change has happened, seeing where people have pushed back against empire, because empires do fall. And they fall when you start to see this type of public response around, what will we live with and what won't we live with? And, honestly, this is where Thea's point around sort of local activism has been so important. What I have been working on recently in the supply chain is looking at high-purity quartz, which is essential for semiconductors. Now, what very few people realized until recently is that around 90% of the world's high-purity quartz comes from the Appalachian Mountains in North Carolina. So I've been spending a lot of time there, getting to know the community, talking to people, flying over the mines, seeing how this crucial node in the AI supply chain was working. And it just so happened that last time I was there, in fact the time before, the penultimate time, 4 days later, Hurricane Helene hit. And it wiped out the town, and it wiped out the mines, and it ended up in the death of over 200 people in this region, this historically depressed region, economically speaking. And what happened next was so profound, which is that within 2 weeks, the mines were back up and running. All of the resources were there to get the mines working, but it took months, in some cases up to 3 months, to get clean water for the residents, and to get sewage working, and to get the schools reopening.
And as I think we understand, those communities are still seeking support from FEMA and still not fully, but the mine is...
And we know what's happened to FEMA's funding, and we know what the ability is to get help to these communities. So for me, this whole story is like, it's a palimpsest. It's a little example of these stories that we've heard on this panel tonight that are playing out again. And we're going to have a moment, because what we're starting to see is local community resistance. We're starting to see it where I've been in Spruce Pine. We're starting to see it where Elon Musk's gigantic data center called Colossus is based in South Memphis. We've seen extraordinary protests now from the historically black community that's based there, living with this pollution of nitrogen dioxide and formaldehyde being pumped into their air. And that's the real sort of frontier of change. So I think there are multiple things we can do. We've heard some fantastic examples on this panel. I wrote a piece for Nature really outlining what I think the AI industry can do from a technical level. But I think we have to have this social conversation about what are we actually going to accept and where are we going to say this is absolutely too much.
Thank you all so much. Fantastic. Okay, we're going to take a few questions.
Everything I heard was extremely interesting, but what I'm missing is a geologic perspective. Not all critical minerals can be found anywhere on the earth. You can dig up the whole United States and you never will find a diamond, because the pressure and the temperature in the rocks within the United States don't allow diamonds to form, okay? You cannot find lithium in Florida. There's a reason that lots of critical minerals occur in Russia and in China and in parts of Africa, because the geology is allowing it for those minerals to occur there. And so what I would suggest is that whole discussion needs to have a geological perspective, and you should get some advice from an economic geologist who knows where minerals that are critical actually can be found and can be mined.
So I would actually say that the whole point of the conversation was to shift to what you might call political ecology. I mean, so I think this was actually quite a geological conversation, and part of the race dynamics that we're talking about are precisely because there are geological deposits in certain places and not in certain places. So this conversation was very much about those natural resource dynamics, but I would offer to turn to others.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that up. Thank you. So, it's interesting because in my couple of books on this topic, I often get an interview response, especially from bureaucrats around the world in different parts of the world that work in the mining, that work in regulating mining or in doing surveying or prospecting, that, the minerals just are where they are. And there's a truth to that. The minerals are where they are. We cannot control yet. I mean, maybe there'll be some new AI invention. I don't know. We cannot control the large timescales of geological processes that result in the production of minerals. They're not, on a human level, they're non-renewable. If we scale out to millennia, we could say they're renewable in perhaps, but the deposits that we have are the ones that we can work with. But let me just throw out a couple of responses there. So first of all, the categories that we use to categorize minerals, there's two sets of them. One is critical minerals or not critical minerals, right? So that's the one you were working with. And critical minerals is to bring in the history and the politics, is a category that changes dramatically over time, right? So what minerals count as critical or not critical are subject to all sorts of geopolitical, economic, technological changes over time, right? So even the category of critical minerals only dates back to the kind of World War II era. Before then, we didn't talk about critical minerals, right? And that was all to define what minerals were necessary for World War II mobilization. That was like the origin of the term, right? Which itself is just a subset of what society might consider critical, right? That was a war effort. It needed tanks. It needed certain things. But there are other goods and services that all of us use, and we might say, well, why is that mineral not on here? Why is that mineral not on here, right? So this is just to say that even just by the standard USGS definition, a critical mineral is something that's essential for either national security or economic functioning and is prone to supply vulnerabilities. That's like a few boxes that need to be checked, and we could do a whole discourse analysis just of that. I'm not gonna do that because we could ask, like, why are national security and economic functioning kind of conflated in this definition? What counts as vulnerable supply? Supply from who to who, right? But I said I won't go there, so I'm not gonna go there. So critical minerals is one. A second, thing, and I think it is useful, like at the beginning of this event, I said that a third of the world's lithium reserves are in the Atacama salt flat, one salt flat of Chile. Reserves. Reserves is the smallest category of geology, right? Before that, we have resources, which is larger, and deposits, which is larger. Deposits is the largest geological category. It's just, we know it's there. But that is a subset of what's there, meaning we only know what we know, right? So there's deposits, and then there's what actually exists. And so there's a lot more out there than we're aware of. And I would push back a little bit. Like, lithium is the 30th most abundant element on Earth, right? There's a huge amount of lithium in the US. We only know a small percentage of it because it hasn't been considered a critical mineral until like 3 years ago, right? So the USGS wasn't super focused on finding it because it wasn't critical. When it was just used in personal electronics and psychiatric uses and stuff, it just didn't have that status, right? And so I guess this is all to say that, like, the planet is really bountiful. We, seem hell-bent on destroying it, but it's really bountiful. And we can discover new methods, including that we've recently discovered that we can find lithium in the wastewater of fracking. So all that, that's where the extractive appendage piece of my book comes in, which is that we can actually mine the toxic waste of fossil fuels because lithium is drawn up in that process of hydraulic fracking, right? And so the question is rarely purely about supply, purely about geology, but why are certain places singled out for being extractive zones? Why would we never think to see what's underneath Wall Street? There might be some minerals there. I mean, we've never mapped it, you know what I mean? And so there's a lot that goes into the cartography of extraction, and it's never like a purely scientific enterprise, but to the extent that it obviously is partly scientific, I would invite geologists into this space, and I've had fascinating conversations with them to think through, like, what are the least harmful sites of extraction? Where would the least energy need to be expended? Where would the least ecological damage occur? It's a different way to look at it than just the kind of map of natural occurrence.
Thank you for that. Yeah. And question?
Thank you. I have two questions. The first, I think, is pretty straightforward. How is it that China has 90% of the rare earth extraction capacity or reprocessing capacity? My second question may seem a little deranged, and that's, is AI worth it? I'm a physicist, and the questions I've asked Google AI or ChatGPT, whatever, are mostly sort of physics-related questions, and the answers I get are either obviously incorrect or contradictory or seem to be, filched out of a freshman textbook, or doesn't know how to multiply powers of 10 correctly. So it's totally useless for any serious research. So I'm left wondering if the space race we're in at the moment is really worth destroying the planet for. So maybe you could address these things.
So I will return to something Fia just said. What is urgent, what is critical, what is necessary, what is strategic? These are all contingent things. These are defined by the moment, by the circumstances of a given moment. I mentioned my time in Africa for the New York Times, which ended in 1998. In 1998 was a very different time from today. In 1998, the United States saw the Soviet Union falling apart and was in a very different moment in terms of its conception of its needs in the world and of the scope of its power and of its possibilities and the like. And the United States in that moment basically said, we've been underwriting African dictatorships for the last 50 years. We don't actually really need to do that anymore. To hell with Africa. We can spare that cost. Let Africa go its own way, do its own thing. Some states will succeed, some states will fail. It won't be our problem. Okay? So in deciding that, and I'm not discussing the merits of that decision, but in deciding that, the United States actually washed its hands of Zaire/Congo. It was American companies that dominated the mineral trade and mineral mining, in short, in Congo back then. Today it is the Chinese. That was a circumstantial development, right? You can't say for any fixed reason why something is the way it is in the domain we're discussing, right? That is something that was defined by the sort of conditions of the moment, right? Alongside of China's move into Africa, and I wrote a book entirely on this subject, which really sort of begins to gather pace in the 1990s. China, at some point, and I'm not an expert in this question, but other panelists will know, China decided that it should not only invest in acquiring minerals that it, for its own purposes, had begun to conceive of as strategic or vital, because China, basically because it's such a big manufacturing power, right? China, alongside of that, the pursuit of these minerals, decided it wanted to be a mineral processing superpower as well. And so it's not just a matter of China has a control of the supply of the raw materials. China also utterly dominates the processing of many of these minerals. And in the terms of the rare earth minerals, the processing involves lots of exotic, technology. So that's I said I didn't know anything about AI. I've just said it all.
That you know quite a lot. Tamara or Kate, did you want to?
I'll just add a couple of points. Rare earth as a term sometimes is a little misleading because, in fact, the rare earth family of minerals are actually much more common in the Earth's crust than most people know. But what makes them so difficult is the extraction process, which is, again, it relies on a sort of specialized technologies, but it's also enormously environmentally destructive. When you go into the practice of refining rare earth, you produce an enormous amount of waste tailings, but also radioactive material. And you can actually go to some truly horrifying sights on this planet, including a black lake in Mongolia that I write about in Atlas of AI, where you can see just as all the way to the horizon, just this black radioactive sludge that is the result of rare earth mining. So part of the reason that rare earth is seen as 90% in China is not because it's the only place you can find it, but because China was the only country willing to take on this horrifying amount of environmental destruction to own this particular market. That is now, of course, under threat because now China has said that it won't export several rare earths to the United States in retaliation to the restrictions on the sale of AI chips to China. And so now that means the United States is leading a whole new push to find rare earth deposits and, of course, go through this refining process in other countries, in the global south, in Australia, and also in parts of the United States. So there's a whole story to be told around how these shifts in global trade and tariffs are actually going to produce new pressures on different parts of the world and also here in the United States. But you raised an amazing question as a physicist, which is AI actually worth it? And in that question is a calculation. It's an assessment. It's a balance of what is it worth and what is the cost. And it's the second part of that sentence that's never being asked. We're just being told that it's worth it. It's being pumped into every system that we touch online, at work, and in our personal lives. But that question of what is the cost to us as individuals, how we think, to how we relate to the people in our families, in our communities, and how we relate to our ecologies. That is the question that's not being asked. And I think part of the reason I subtitle Atlas of AI sort of the planetary costs of artificial intelligence is to introduce that into the equation. Because I think AI might be very useful in very specific contexts, but there are many contexts where it's being applied where it is absolutely not useful at all, but it's being sold that you must use it as though this is a hammer and so everything becomes a nail. And that's what we have to bring it into.
Thank you. So we'll do one last question. This is one of our colleagues from the workshop. So introduce yourself, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Yok Ling, and I'm from Malaysia. It's amazing. I can't wait for tomorrow's workshop. I think where you ended just now with what Kat said, it was alluded to. You talked about, we don't need so many. Sustainability is not moving from fossil fuel-driven cars to electric cars. It's about public transport. So I think the issue of consumption and what technology for what purpose and who controls and develops for what purpose, I think those are really fundamental questions in the equation, because otherwise we will just keep extracting. So I'm really glad this has come out, and I think that's the part of research. And politically, consumption is one of the hardest things to tackle, and always put as a personal choice, but it isn't. When we're told AI is inevitable, it was not a personal choice. So the other thing I wanted to raise was how much of the research that is actually needed now is actually in the deep sea nodules of all these materials, because we know even less about the ocean. We don't have grassroots protests, but in the Pacific, there is a lot of grassroots protests from the indigenous peoples and the islanders, for whom the oceans are more than just water. And I think there's a lot of exciting work that we should be connecting to. We have colleagues who are working on this. And the intersection between militarization, sovereignty, resource control, and now in the deep sea mining is very, very emerging, and it's very powerful. So that's an area I think for us to think about. But the science around deep sea nodules is just incredible. It's only recently they discovered that those nodules for minerals are actually ecosystems, which was what I was so struck by what you said about the salt pans, because it's exactly the same in the deep sea. And they just discovered last year that oxygen is being generated not through photosynthesis, but electrolysis by these same nodules which we're going to destroy. And we're going to go in there, and there's a huge fight to start mining in the deep sea. And so I think this is an area of research which, if not done already, certainly is very urgent. But thank you so much to IAS and to the panelists.
Thank you. I can't wait for tomorrow's conversation. Any last remarks from any of you all?
Just for people to be aware, there's currently an enormous geopolitical conflict, and I know I'm looking at an expert in the room sitting behind you that is very expert in deep sea mining. But for people who may not have followed the news on this, Trump recently made a move to basically sideline the International Seabed Authority, which is the UN body where a lot of this kind of politicking and diplomacy around what are the governance, I mean, we're talking about governance frameworks for AI, but like, what are the governance frameworks for the deep sea mining, right? And there were countries with different power positions in the global economy doing the thing of negotiation, diplomacy, and Trump, found a the Trump administration, not Trump himself probably, found a loophole where the US had never ratified the treaty for the International Seabed Authority. So actually, it doesn't apply to us. So actually now the US is potentially fast-tracking the permit for, I think it's called the Metals Company, which is the company that's been really at the forefront of this. And so there might be a reality, with forthcoming executive orders, like within a month or a year from now, in which the US has single-handedly issued the first permit for deep sea mining, while the science is still being done, while the diplomacy is being done in this other UN body, and just again sidestepping that multilateralism. So I think it really is something to watch and be aware of, and we could move from a place where this is science fiction or early stage science research into a much more material reality. And then I am quite curious whether there is civil society or more protest kind of in response or not.
I would just say thank you. Thank you so much for that question, and it's such an important place to end. If people are interested in learning more, there's a stunning exhibition right now at Columbia, just in your neck of the woods, by Anton Linker, specifically on deep sea mining, where he collected all of those conversations that have been happening at the level of the international treaty over years at the UN, but also spoke to so many people who are the scientists who are studying the ocean floor and saying this is an extraordinary domain that we simply don't understand, and that has so much that we can learn, and that it's about to be destroyed in these sort of these now recent decisions that have come from this administration. So I think you're absolutely right that that's exactly one of the cases where we can say, for whom is this a pressing issue? Which communities will come together? And I think we've seen part of this in the Pacific Islands, but we need to make this a global issue.
Tamara, Howard, any final words?
To the physicist, I think the kinds of tasks that you referred to are going to get worked out pretty quickly. But those are not, multiplying things to the 10th power and figuring out, physics equations, I think is well within the capabilities, if not present in the very near future of AI. I think the problem is the problem that has been raised here most recently in this conversation. What's the cost of these things? What's the cost? And the cost isn't just the dollar cost or the cost in water. Those are real costs. The costs are also the human costs. Like, what are we doing to ourselves as human beings when we insist that everything must pass through AI? I have students who've written papers, I teach journalism, in the last year about, from I don't want to be uncharitable here, but from what struck me as an extremely naive perspective, right, about, isn't it great that AI now can serve as can replace a psychologist or a therapist, right? Well, yeah, but is there a cost there, right? AI can replace your boyfriend or your girlfriend. This is a real thing, yes, but is there a cost there? We're not talking about the costs of these things as we willy-nilly accept them. And on the nodules thing, I would just return to Angola, which I think is in my current mode of pessimism, a very effective dictum, right? The continuing construction of Brazil requires the continuous destruction of Angola. The ocean, Zaire, Congo, New Guinea, wherever the stuff we've decided we must have it because we can't afford to lose this race is going to get plowed under if nothing is done. And that's what this conversation needs to be about. What is the cost?
Yeah, well, and I think the question of the national security line right now being used as an excuse to further concentrate resources and power, right? It's a very helpful line for the people who right now are at a handful of companies attempting to build AGI, or artificial general intelligence, that they claim may eventually kill us or, allow us to become digital transcendent beings that can eventually go to different galaxies and continue our colonization of space. But these are really fantastical ideas of what the future of AI can be that are not grounded in the existing harms and forms of extraction that are happening right now. And I think what we need to do desperately is to slow down the process and take time to answer that question for ourselves. Why are we building this kind of technology, and who is it serving?
Tamara Neist, Theo Riofranco's, Howard French, Kate Crawford, thank you very much.